Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, seekers of truth, today I stand before you to uncover a hidden piece of history, a piece buried deep beneath layers of silence and manipulation, a piece called the Book of Jubilees. Some of you may have never heard of the Book of Jubilees, and that is not an accident. The Book of Jubilees, also known as the Little Genesis, is an ancient Jewish religious text that retells the story of Genesis and parts of Exodus with much more detail and commentary. Written around the 2nd century BCE, the Book of Jubilees presents a chronological, priestly interpretation of biblical history, organized according to Jubilees periods of 49 years, 7 cycles of 7 years. Unlike the regular Book of Genesis, which provides a more general narrative of the creation, the patriarchs, and the early history of Israel, Jubilees breaks these events down with precise timelines, laws, and moral lessons, offering a structured and expanded version of biblical story. One of the unique aspects of Jubilees is that it claims to be a revelation given to Moses by angels on Mount Sinai, in which the angels explain to Moses the history of creation and God's dealings with humanity. It presents itself not as a human written book, but as a divine record, giving it significant weight in ancient religious thought. After the flood, Jubilees describes how Noah divided the entire world among his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, assigning them specific territory. According to this division, the land of Ham included Africa and parts of Asia, including what would later be known as Egypt and Ethiopia. This division is essential because it establishes a historical and divine claim of certain people to specific lands, challenging later colonial narratives. The Book of Jubilees emphasizes strict adherence to the laws of God, including the observance of the Sabbath, dietary laws, circumcision, and festivals. Many of these laws align with Torah commandments, but are often presented with additional detail, showing a deep concern for maintaining holiness and separation from corrupt nations. Jubilees introduces the role of angels and heavenly beings, expanding on stories only hinted at in Genesis, such as the Watchers, fallen angels, who took human wives and led to the birth of giants, Nephilim. These elements give insight into ancient beliefs about spiritual warfare and divine justice. A central theme is God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the promise that their descendants, the Israelites, would be his chosen people. But it also warns that disobedience would lead to exile and suffering. The Book of Jubilees is one of the most powerful and controversial ancient texts, and for good reason. Although once respected and preserved among certain Jewish and early Christian communities, it was ultimately banned and excluded from the biblical canon that most of the world recognizes today. But why would such an important book, rich in historical, spiritual, and prophetic content, be rejected and suppressed? The reasons are deep, involving religious, political, and racial implications that challenge those in power. First, the Book of Jubilees gave great authority to specific laws and customs that religious leaders of later generations wanted to move away from. For example, Jubilees emphasizes the strict observance of the Sabbath, festivals, and purity laws, in some cases even more rigidly than the Torah. After the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE, Rabbinic Judaism began to evolve, and many leaders wanted to reinterpret or relax certain laws to adapt to new realities of Jewish life in exile. Furthermore, Jubilees' portrayal of angels, heavenly tablets, and divine revelation given directly to Moses challenged the growing rabbinic system that emphasized human interpretation of the Torah. To accept Jubilees would be to accept that there was secret angelic knowledge not accessible to ordinary scholars, thus undermining the authority of rabbinic teachers and later Christian bishops. Secondly, the Book of Jubilees describes how the earth was divided among the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, with each receiving specific territories according to Jubilees. The descendants of Ham were given the regions of Africa and parts of Asia. If widely known and accepted, this division would affirm the rights of African peoples, Ham's descendants, to their own lands and identity, challenging later colonialist narratives that claimed these lands could be discovered or conquered. During the rise of European colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade, justifying the enslavement and oppression of black people required erasing or distorting their history. The Book of Jubilees, with its clear assignment of Africa to Ham and acknowledgement of a divine inheritance, directly opposed those oppressive ideologies. Rulers and church authorities feared that such texts would empower black people to reclaim their spiritual and historical identity, leading to resistance against slavery and colonial domination. Additionally, the Book of Jubilees preserves details about ancient peoples and events that could disrupt the whitewash version of biblical history promoted in Europe and other parts of the world. It ties African and Middle Eastern peoples directly to biblical covenants and promises, implying that God's chosen people included darker-skinned descendants of Ham and Shem. Accepting this book would force the world to reconsider who the Israelites were, what they looked like, and where they lived. It would undermine centuries of racial and cultural misrepresentation, thus threatening the foundations of white supremacy that shaped much of Western Christianity. Finally, early Christian communities that embraced the Book of Jubilees were often in conflict with those who sought to universalize Christianity, moving away from Jewish laws to appeal to Gentiles. Since Jubilees reaffirms many of these laws, it did not align with the emerging universal church's direction, leading to its rejection. The Book of Jubilees is more than just an ancient religious text. It is a key that unlocks a hidden understanding of black history, identity, and destiny. To see this connection, we need to look at what Jubilees says about the descendants of Noah, the division of the earth, and the covenant with God's chosen people, and how these truths have been buried to keep black people disconnected from their roots. One of the most significant aspects of the Book of Jubilees is its detailed explanation of how Noah divided the earth among his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. According to Jubilees, Ham's descendants were given the territories of Africa, referred to as the land of Ham, and parts of what we now call the Middle East. Ham's sons, Cush, Ethiopian/Sudanese, Mizraim, Egypt, Put, Libyans, and Canaan became the ancestors of the great African civilizations that existed long before European colonization. Yet as time passed, these ancient black nations were falsely portrayed as cursed, inferior, and savage, a twisting of the curse of Ham narrative that has no true foundation in Scripture. Jubilees instead affirms Ham's rightful inheritance of vast, prosperous lands, countering racist teachings that were used to justify slavery and oppression. The Book of Jubilees also prophesies what would happen to God's chosen people if they disobeyed his commandments. They would be scattered among the nations, enslaved and oppressed. When we look at black history, from the transatlantic slave trade to colonialism, Jim Crow laws, apartheid, and ongoing systemic racism, this prophecy rings true. Many black communities around the world, especially those in the Americas, the Caribbean, and parts of Europe, have long suspected that they are part of the lost tribes of Israel, descendants of the ancient people who entered into covenant with God. Jubilees speaks directly to this legacy of struggle, loss, and the hope of restoration, making it a book of powerful relevance for black people seeking to reclaim their identity. For centuries, black people have been erased from biblical history. Images of biblical figures as white Europeans dominate religious art and education. But Jubilees, by tracing the lineage of Ham and Shem, shows that the ancient Israelites and their surrounding nations were people of color, connected by blood and covenant to the lands of Africa and the Middle East. This connection is more than symbolic. It reclaims the dignity, value, and spiritual importance of black people, reminding them that they are not an afterthought in history, but central figures in God's plan. In modern times, there's a growing movement among black scholars, theologians, and spiritual leaders to reclaim these hidden books and restore the true history of their people. The Book of Jubilees is being revisited as a source of strength and knowledge, offering hope and identity to a people long cut off from their heritage. One of the most profound and empowering truths revealed in the Book of Jubilees is its clear affirmation that Africa was divinely given to Ham and his descendants. This is not a myth or legend, but a historical and spiritual account of how after the great flood, Noah divided the earth among his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, granting each of them and their descendants a specific and everlasting inheritance. The Book of Jubilees records that Ham, the father of black nations, was given the lands of Africa and surrounding regions, a vast and rich inheritance that was intended for his lineage forever. Ham's children, Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan, became the founding fathers of some of the greatest civilizations the world has ever known. Cush is the forefather of the Ethiopians, Mizraim of the Egyptians, Put of the Libyans, and Canaan of the Canaanites. These names are not just ancient relics. They are direct ties to the powerful, advanced, and sophisticated African societies that built pyramids, established mighty kingdoms, and led the world in knowledge, science, and culture. This undeniable connection recorded in the Book of Jubilees places black people at the center of biblical history, not on the margins where later narratives sought to push them. However, through centuries of colonization, slavery, and deliberate historical revision, this truth was buried. The narrative was twisted, and a false doctrine, the so-called curse of Ham, was spread to justify the enslavement and dehumanization of black people. But what is astonishing is that the Book of Jubilees contains no such curse on Ham. Instead, it affirms that Ham's descendants were blessed with their own territories, filled with natural wealth and beauty, intended to be their home forever. The story of Ham was transformed into a tool of oppression. But the real story is one of dignity, inheritance, and divine purpose. The suppression of the Book of Jubilees itself is no accident. By removing this book from mainstream religious texts, those in power ensured that black people would remain disconnected from this empowering knowledge of their true identity. If the world had embraced the message of Jubilees, it would have been impossible to justify the brutal history of African enslavement and colonization. The text boldly confirms that Africa was already owned, loved, and blessed by God long before any empire sought to claim it. The book's message strikes at the very heart of colonialism, exposing it as a violation of divine order and a theft of God-given lands. Recognizing this truth today is essential for restoring a lost heritage. For people of African descent, the Book of Jubilees is a key to unlocking a buried identity. It tells black people that their ancestors were not savages or cursed beings, but rightful heirs of a blessed land. Africa is not simply a geographic location. It is the land of kings, queens, prophets, and wise men and women, a land chosen by God for the descendants of Ham. This powerful truth brings dignity and purpose to a people whose history has been distorted and whose identity has been stolen. To embrace the message of the Book of Jubilees is to reclaim this legacy with pride. It is a call to stand tall in the knowledge that black people are an essential part of the biblical story, connected to the same God who made covenants with Noah, Abraham, and Moses. It is a reminder that black history is sacred history and that the future can be built on the foundation of truth, strength, and divine inheritance. After centuries of being told otherwise, the time has come for this truth to rise again, to inspire a new generation to walk boldly in their rightful identity and destiny. For centuries, the true identity and heritage of black people have been stolen, hidden, and deliberately erased from the pages of history. This was not an accident of time, but a calculated effort to sever an entire people from their divine origins, cultural greatness, and spiritual authority. The Book of Jubilees stands as one of the clearest witnesses to the truth of that legacy. a legacy that speaks of royal bloodlines, sacred covenants, and divine inheritance. To understand what has been lost, we must first understand what was taken. The knowledge that black people are directly connected to the most ancient and powerful figures in biblical history. That they are descendants of Ham, whose lineage was blessed with vast, rich lands and enduring significance. The Book of Jubilees records the division of the earth after the flood, and in that division, Africa and its surrounding regions were given to Ham and his children. This was a divine assignment, an everlasting gift from the Creator himself. Yet over time, this truth was buried under layers of lies and distortions. Colonial powers and slave traders manipulated the narrative, creating false doctrines like the so-called curse of Ham to justify the brutal enslavement and oppression of black people. They painted Ham and his descendants as cursed and inferior, flipping the truth on its head to serve their own greed and domination. What was once a story of inheritance and blessing was twisted into a weapon of shame and control. The erasure of this legacy was not only physical through the chains of slavery and the destruction of African civilizations, but also spiritual and mental, stripping away the knowledge of self, of identity, of divine purpose. By removing books like Jubilees from the public's hands, by limiting the canon to suit their agenda, they ensured that black people would be cut off from the knowledge of their ancient greatness and connection to God. They would be cut off from knowing that their ancestors built mighty nations, led with wisdom, and were chosen to inhabit some of the most resource-rich lands on earth. This disconnection has left deep wounds that still affect generations today, a loss of identity, pride, and unity. But the truth cannot remain buried forever. Now, as more and more people begin to uncover and study the Book of Jubilees and other ancient writings, the stolen legacy is being restored. Black people are waking up to the knowledge that they are not outsiders to the biblical story. They are central to it. They are the descendants of kings and prophets, of nations that once stood as beacons of culture and power. The restoration of this legacy means reclaiming a history that was never meant to be lost. It means understanding that Africa was not a place of darkness waiting to be civilized, but was the birthplace of some of the most advanced and spiritual societies in human history, chosen and blessed by God himself. Restoring this legacy is also about healing. It is about lifting the burden of false shame and replacing it with truth and pride. It is about standing tall in the knowledge that black people have always had a divine purpose and that their story is intertwined with the very foundations of faith and civilization. The Book of Jubilees offers not only historical clarity, but a spiritual awakening, calling black people to remember who they are and to reclaim their rightful place in the ongoing story of humanity. This restoration is not merely about looking backward. It is about building a future where black children grow up knowing that they are descendants of greatness. A future where the truth of their origins empowers them to lead, to heal, and to rise beyond the limitations placed on them by a world built on lies. The Book of Jubilees is a key to that future, a reminder that what was stolen can be restored, that what was hidden can now be revealed, and that the time has come to embrace the full truth of black identity, history, and destiny. The Book of Jubilees stands as a direct and undeniable challenge to the colonial lies that have shaped the world's understanding of history and the place of black people within it. For centuries, colonial empires built their power on the myth that Africa was a land without civilization, a place of savagery that needed the light of European intervention. They claimed to bring religion, culture, and progress to a continent they depicted as primitive. But the Book of Jubilees completely destroys that false narrative by reminding us that the lands of Africa were divinely given to Ham and his descendants by God himself. These lands were not empty, nor were they void of culture and greatness. They were filled with powerful nations, ancient knowledge, and people directly connected to the divine covenant made with Noah and his sons. Jubilees makes it clear that Ham and his children were blessed with some of the most fertile, rich, and resource-laden territories on earth. This contradicts the colonial image of Africa as a backward land waiting for foreign rulers to bring civilization. Long before Europe even existed as a power, Ham's descendants had already established mighty kingdoms like Cush, Ethiopia, Mizraim, Egypt, and Put. Libya. These were societies that built monuments, still standing today, developed advanced systems of governance, medicine, and science, and carried deep spiritual wisdom. Yet this truth was suppressed because acknowledging it would expose the wickedness of colonization and slavery for what they truly were: acts of theft, violence, and deception against a people who were already rich in culture and connected to God. Moreover, this is a spiritual inheritance, an inheritance of faith, covenant, and destiny. The Book of Jubilees reminds black people that they are part of the divine promise, tied to the same God who blessed Noah's sons and who established covenants meant to last through generations. Reclaiming this inheritance means reconnecting with God, not through the distorted lens handed down by oppressors, but through the true knowledge of being His people, called to live in righteousness, wisdom, and strength. It means embracing a spiritual role as teachers, builders, and preservers of God's justice on earth. To answer this call is to stand against everything that has been used to keep black people down, to reject the lies of inferiority, to challenge the systems that continue to steal from African nations, and to heal from the wounds of the past. It is a call to restore the broken places, to revive the lost cultures, and to rebuild the spiritual foundations that colonialism tried to destroy. It is a call to rise with dignity, knowing that their story is written in the books of heaven, that they are heirs to a promise no man can erase. The Book of Jubilees is a light in the darkness, a reminder that though the world may have tried to silence this truth, God has never forgotten. The time has come for black people to remember, to return, and to reclaim all that was taken, to walk again as a people of purpose, power, and divine calling. This is not only a restoration of history, but a rebirth of destiny. The inheritance that was given from the beginning is waiting to be claimed again. And it starts with knowing who they are in the eyes of God, chosen, blessed, and destined for greatness. Destined for greatness. Destined for greatness. Destined for greatness. Destined for greatness.